David, how's it going, buddy?
What's up, dude?
It's
It's
been
funny, but
it's been a minute.
before we go on break, we're always like, hey man, I'll talk to you at some point during break, and then we both go our separate ways to spring break, and we don't speak again until typically we're about to record a podcast about 10
Yeah,
days later. So yeah,
yeah.
it's good
We
seeing
were,
you.
Victor, we both went on pretty long road trips, and it's always interesting because like David goes to like an extreme level of road trip where it's like 16 hours straight with three kids in the back of the car, and I'm just like, dude, I don't know how you do it. Like we're at 6 or 7 hours, and like we're all about to go bonkers. But David, again, I don't know how you do it, man. Like, kudos to you.
It's conditioning, dude. We started when they were like born, and I mean, my kids do two of these 16-hour trips each way a year, and they're used to it. It's just they know not to ask to stop and pee. And
Just hold it.
hey, and now we drove the hybrid this time, so like I'm like, hey, we got 500 miles,
Oh,
boys and
dude.
girls. So you better
Do
lock
you
it
do
down.
you give them like pee bottles in the back
Nah,
and
man,
no?
self-control, self-control. I'm the limb fact, dude. I'm the limiting factor, right? As we get older, and Victor, you look young. You have beautiful head of hair with the nicely accented salt and pepper action. So you're probably not experiencing it, but usually I'm like, hey, we're stopping now.
Definitely. I'm also the limiting factor on that.
Yeah,
It's
good,
about
good.
it's about, I feel like that's about the age of like 42, 43 is when it hit
Yeah,
me. Like,
yeah. All
all right, now I
downhill.
gotta pee like every hour.
Yeah, all downhill.
Yeah. Oh, cool.
Good.
Well, it's good to be back in the office, back in recording. Victor, we're looking forward to this conversation. For our audience, if you would, just give us a little bit of background about who you are and what you do.
Yeah. So my name is Victor Boutros. I am the CEO and co-founder of Human Trafficking Institute. I was a federal prosecutor for almost a decade at the U.S. Department of Justice when it was just forming its first human trafficking prosecution unit, which was the first group of federal prosecutors who would work cases across the country. So I traveled across the country, directed teams of federal agents, and worked these cases start to finish. And was one of the great gifts of my life to get to be a part of that team and to do that work. And then left the Justice Department to launch Human Trafficking Institute to really take some of the successful work that we did at the Justice Department and use that and deploy that globally and now here in the U.S. And so I'm married and have four kids and very excited to be a part of this podcast.
Hey, thank you, Victor. I'm just curious, as a nation, do we do a good job of, from the government side of it to go out, seek, find, prosecute, all the things to counter human trafficking? Are we doing a pretty good job or no?
It's all relative. So I think relative to what's happening in developing countries, I think the U.S. can be very proud of its record that we've really made some really strategic investments in ramping up trafficking enforcement. So while I was at the Justice Department, we launched a pilot to try to improve the federal response to stopping traffickers. We launched it in six federal districts around the U.S. And within 2 years, those six districts had convicted more traffickers than the other 88 federal districts combined. So
That's
we saw a
awesome.
massive increase, 114% increase in traffickers prosecuted in those districts that were the pilots versus 12% in the rest of the country. So that, anybody who's been in the government knows we throw parties if there's 2 or 3% increases. So that was pretty unheard of. So I was very excited about that. That's now spreading in the US at the federal level. And then there's a lot of great work happening at the state level. It's just harder to measure because the federal system basically has all the data in one single system and it's applying one uniform law. So we at Human Trafficking Institute have now mapped over 1 million data points from every single federal human trafficking case from 2000 to the present to try to track key trends of how traffickers are behaving and what they're responding to. And now we at HTI are starting to engage at the state level in seeing if we could bring what's become a globally recognized model here into the US. And so I'm very excited about that. That's one of the things I'm most excited about going into this coming year.
Well, that's interesting too, because you see, there's quite a few different organizations, nonprofit organizations that are battling human trafficking. Some big names, some other smaller groups, And then, there's the movies and all the things you hear about, and it all seems like everyone is focused only overseas. It's Asia, it's Africa, it's like these third world countries where, there's more of a reason to do the trafficking. But man, the more like you get into it and understand it and learn it and talk to people like you, there's a lot. There's a lot that's going on right here in the United States, right here in our backyard. There's lots of different things going on, and I'm curious what you've seen as far as the amount of growth or decline here, in the United States versus overseas.
Yeah, we had no shortage of cases when I was at the Justice Department. I think we had cases in literally every state in the US. And so there's no shortage of cases to be done. And I do think that there's been significant growth in enforcement over the last 20 years, certainly federally. And I suspect that's true at the state level. We just don't have great ways to track that. And so that's one of the things we're trying to address. But I do think that, we've really invested in building out now a model that we know works at stopping trafficking. And now it's just a question of how effectively can we scale that model. And to your point, when I was at the Justice Department, we came upon this pilot that was very effective. And then I took a sabbatical and wrote a book with a friend of mine called The Locust Effect: Why the End of Poverty Requires the End of Violence. And what we discovered is 93% of the world's victims are in developing countries, which really blew me away at the time because I was so excited about this pilot. And I remember having this moment of realizing, wow, even if this pilot that we're doing at the Justice Department was so effective that it eliminated all the trafficking that's taking place in the US and Canada and Western Europe and Australia and Japan, we'd still have 93% of the victims out there. So we're not impacting trafficking at scale if we're not impacting traffickers in developing countries. And that was part of the impetus for me to say, is it time for me to leave the Justice Department and to take this model that we now know works to the places where trafficking is exploding because there's effectively zero enforcement. And that's where we thought, man, we could make the biggest difference. Because I knew that if I left the Justice Department, there's a stack of resumes this high of incredibly talented prosecutors who are ready and willing to do a job that has that kind of moral force and significance. But no one was really deploying this model in the developing world where trafficking is blowing up. So we felt like we could make a huge difference there. And over time, I really, we had lots of questions of should we do something in the US? And I was very intent on, hey, we don't want to reduplicate resources that are already being deployed effectively. So we don't want to duplicate existing efforts. So it took some testing before we launched HTI Texas. We really wanted to assess, is there a need? Is there a demand? And so we went to some like large law enforcement conferences. I'm talking like 4,000 police. And we started asking, how many of you guys have received capacity building and human trafficking enforcement? Tons of people raised their hand. We said, okay, well, here's a dash cam that started a real case. We're going to show it to you. How many of you are confident that you would recognize this as human trafficking and know what to do? And it was like crickets. First year we did it, we said, well, you shouldn't leave this without knowing what to do here. So first year we got complaints. There's not enough room in the breakout room that we were training in. Second year they gave us a ballroom. Still complaints, not enough room. And that to me was a huge eye opener of like, oh, maybe there's a lot of quote unquote training happening, but training is not an end in itself. Training is only good if it actually can drive outcomes. If it's not actually stopping more traffickers, putting them behind bars and protecting more victims, then it's actually just a grand waste of time. And so for us, that's been what's very distinctive about our model is we don't just measure how many people came to a training capacity piece, but we actually directly equip these teams of police and prosecutors that we work with tailored skills to drive more cases against traffickers. And then we measure that from start to finish. So we can start to see what is the direct impact from what we're doing in the number of traffickers stopped and put in jail and the number of victims protected through law enforcement operations and deterrence. And that's where I felt like, oh, there is a need here. What would it look like if we could take Texas, which has the highest per capita rates of cyber tips of children being exploited online? What if we could take that's per capita, not because it's a big state. What if we could take a state like Texas and help it become literally the highest performing enforcement state in the US? And that's the vision that we have. that we're beginning to execute on at HTI Texas.
Yeah, that's awesome, man. I love how much data as well. Like I think there's a lot of, especially in the realm of anti-human trafficking, there's a lot of, the images and there's the heartstrings pulling and there's a lot of emotion tied to whether it's giving or I want to take action, but the data speaks. And I love how you guys are you even to drive your focus where you're going to focus in the world because I think there's a lot of emotion that's like, oh, this happens in our own backyard, let's and yes, it shouldn't happen anywhere. It's never acceptable and it's always disgusting. But it's fascinating to me how you guys derived how you got to the place of, hey man, this is where we need to maximize our efforts to maximize the impact. And you've alluded to it a couple times, but you said you talked about the proven model. Let's talk about the proven model. What is it that you guys specifically do, and how do you do it?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, David. And for me, the impact piece was really important. And I'll talk about the model, but I did want to underline that because at least for me, and I think as I've talked more and more about this, a lot of people feel today, as I did 20 years ago, which for me, the story of human trafficking came in the form of a very particular case. It was involving a young 12-year-old girl from a very poor family in India who sent their daughter, this 12-year-old girl, they sent the family sent her to the big city to get a job where she was basically washing dishes in a restaurant, earning money that she could bring back to the family. End of the summer, she's got her summer money. She's getting ready to head back home to her village. But to do that, she's got to catch a train in Victoria Station, which is one of the busiest train stations on the planet. And she is 12. She's totally overwhelmed by the chaos of the train station. She can't figure out where to go. A couple of older women see her looking distressed and they say, "Hey, are you doing okay?" She says, "I can't find my train." They said, "Well, where are you going?" And so she tells them, they said, "Oh, that's our same train. We'll show you where that is." So she's very relieved that these ladies are looking out for her. They get on the train together. They start chatting. They have some tea. And it turns out the tea is drugged. And so she's knocked out cold. When she wakes up, she finds herself on the third floor of a brothel in the red light district of Mumbai, where these two women have sold her for the equivalent of 250 American dollars. And from that point forward, she said, "Hey, I want to go home." They said, "No, you can't do that. I paid good money for you. You're now going to make money for me by serving the customers at the brothels. And you've got a quota. You got to serve a 7 to 12 minute day, 7 days a week." And from that point forward, that becomes her day-to-day reality. And meanwhile, here's her parents over here at the rural train station. They have no idea why she's not on the train. They don't know where she is. They don't even know how to begin to start looking for her. And when I heard about that story in that case, it just made my blood boil. I felt like, how do you do that to a 12-year-old girl? This is not someone who's making some kind of economic decision to make money by engaging in commercial sex. This is a 12-year-old who just wants to go home to her family. We talk about these political and moral debates and where there's a lot of nuance and there's voices on both sides. It's like, this is not that. This is actually black and white. Everybody knows that is wrong and it should stop and it should stop now. And at the moment, I couldn't describe that at the time, but I almost had this sort of divided soul moment where my heart is saying, what do we have to do to get her out today? No more today. We got to step up. We got to stop the trafficker. We got to get her out. And my head's going, Vic, you can't draw near to this. Her story is one of a million stories. If you had a snapshot of every girl that's going through this, you just have millions of snapshots. You can't draw close to this issue. It's like getting too close to a fire that you can't put out. You're going to get burned. You got to back away. And for a while, I didn't want to hear from any anti-trafficking organizations because I didn't want to be rude and say this out loud. But in my head, what I was thinking is, whatever you guys are doing, it's just going to be a drop in the ocean. It's not really going to make a difference. You're not really making a dent in this. And of course, you don't want to say that to someone who's given their life to doing something. You don't want to be demoralizing and rude, but that's what I really felt. And what I wanted in that moment, but didn't have, was tangible hope. Not just God will write this one day in the end, but for me, it was if there were a proven model that I really knew worked and that was actually doable, that we could really deploy, and that would protect not just a couple victims, but could protect millions of victims, then my head and my heart would be aligned. And I would be like, let's step up and stop the trafficker. And that didn't exist 25 years ago when I was first learning about this, but it does today. And I think that stewardship of that tangible hope is what you guys in this podcast, I think, are doing today. And what we can all do together, because the ultimate tragedy would be we're all backing away from the fire at the very moment where we could actually, we're feeling powerless. We're feeling the sense of moral urgency and the sense of powerlessness at the very moment where we can actually see trafficking stopped at scale for the first time in history. And so to me, that's the exciting piece here. And we have that now. We have that proven model that's actually doable that can protect millions. So what does that look like? You asked about how does this model work? What we do at HTI is we enter into formal partnerships with the governments that we work with. So let's say a country like Uganda. We'll go enter into a formal partnership agreement with Uganda basically to do three things. First, we help develop and vet specialized units. So these are teams of police and prosecutors who are now assigned to enforce that country's anti-trafficking laws. Second, we begin to study what are the pain points that are holding those teams back from really delivering on that enforcement. And we begin to equip them with tailored tools and tactics to solve those problems so they can build strong cases against traffickers. And the third thing we do, and this is critical, is under this partnership agreement, we have built out a core of some of the most experienced human trafficking enforcement experts on the planet. These are former highly seasoned human trafficking prosecutors, highly seasoned FBI agents, or police officers who have left their government jobs, come on to the HTI team full time, move to that partner country like Uganda, and then under this partnership agreement, they begin to operate inside the criminal justice system where they begin to work day in and day out with these units, helping them build their skills, solve case related challenges, and drive strong cases against traffickers. And then we measure that from start to finish. And in Uganda in particular, we've seen some of the largest increases in enforcement in history. Using the State Department's data, we can start to track just how significant that is. And so that's sort of the heart of how the model works. And I think it's important to have those stories. We talked about stories and anecdotes and emotions and how powerful those can be. I just shared one with you that really moved my heart and changed the course of my life. But every social movement starts with stories and anecdotes and emotions, but there's an inflection point that takes place when all of a sudden you have a big player that comes in and says, hey, we now have a data tested strategy that we know works and can scale. And that's usually not the end of that problem, but it's the beginning of the end. That's when we know we've got something that if we deploy our resources, we can begin to see massive change. And I think that's where we are today. For the first time in history, the US government did a big analysis. They've been investing in anti-trafficking strategies for over 25 years. They finally did an analysis and said, okay, we've been funding these strategies through 19 different federal agencies. Where are we seeing the biggest return on our investment? Where are we seeing the biggest impact? And they put that out. We didn't know they were doing this. And HTI's work was at the top of that list, which is obviously very exciting for our team. We have this incredible team that works very, very hard, is very motivated by this work. But I think it's also, to your point, David, a critical inflection point that we can all be excited about for the larger movement because we're starting to see that shift from stories and anecdotes and emotions to data tested strategies that we know work and can scale.
Yeah, and just one point of you mentioned this before we hit record, and I really I'm a word picture. I'm a simple knuckle dragging kind of guy. So but when you framed it as kind of changing the paradigm of what you're going after, right? It's not so much, it's not the victim, it's not aftercare, it's not freeing children from this. Yeah, all those things are byproducts, but your focus, no kidding, the strategy that you're talking about is like warheads on foreheads type, like go after the bad guys. Go after the
Yes.
bad guys and make it not an attractive business proposition for them. And that drives a huge impact. And if you don't mind just framing that, you did it beautifully before, and I don't want to butcher that.
No, that's so true, David, because if you start looking at, well, where does the anti-trafficking funding go? Like, what are we actually funding? What interventions are we funding? Most of those interventions fall into one of two buckets. It's either trying to reduce the vulnerability of potential victims. So that would be things like poverty alleviation or awareness campaigns or education, all very important. Or it's going to caring for survivors, people who were trafficked but aren't anymore. And of course, they need shelters, they need trauma therapy, they need counseling, they need vocational support, also very important. But when I was at the Justice Department working these cases, sometimes you would sit across the table from a trafficker who would plead guilty and have to walk you through their entire business model from A to Z as they got ready to testify against other traffickers in exchange for a reduced sentence. And it was a very eye-opening experience. And what I discovered very quickly is they don't really care about those interventions. They look at our efforts to reduce victim vulnerability, and honestly, they kind of scoff at it and they go, guys, this, you don't get it. This is like a stocked pond with a billion fish in it. If you want to try to inoculate and protect a couple 100,000 fish, knock yourselves out. But you know what? Tomorrow I'm going to show up with my same fishing pole and my same bait, and I'm going to walk away with all the fish I want. Doesn't bother me at all. I don't care which fish I'm getting as long as I'm getting fish. And then they look at our efforts to care for survivors. We had one trafficker who, in a case, it was a very dark moment, but he asked, it was a sex trafficking case, and he said, "Oh, where are the girls at? Where are the victims at?" So we're not going to tell you that. He laughed. He said, "That's all right. We know we're in there. They're probably in a shelter somewhere." He said, "You don't get it. We like it when you guys spend your money on shelters." We said, "Why?" He said, "Well, because by that time I'm done with them. I've already moved on to the next set of victims. So I'm not making any less money when you guys, quote, clean up our mess." And you're like, oh my gosh, what a dark, ugly, horrific thing to say, but a very eye-opening window into how traffickers see this crime. For them, their victims are just nameless, faceless profit
That's
units,
the
and they don't
truth,
really
right?
care. They don't care
That's
what
the
you do for
truth.
making them money, as long as they're making their money. So for me, the question was, is there a way for us to not just deal with the tragic consequences of trafficking after the fact, when it's so, so hard to recover from that trauma, but can we move upstream and stop this at its source, which is really the trafficker? Because if you can stop the trafficker from making that decision to use force and threats and violence, then not only do you free their current victims, but you spare that future stream of victims from ever enduring that trauma in the first place. And that's what they want. If you actually talk to survivors, what they want more than anything else is to never have endured that trauma in the first place. And even the best aftercare on the planet cannot deliver that to them. But if we can go upstream and thin out those traffickers, that just means that there's all these victims who never endure that in the first place. And I think that's where we can see game-changing impact.
I'm reading a book right now called The Starfish and the Spider. I don't know if you've heard of it. It's about, centralized versus decentralized commands and businesses. And it just makes me think about kind of this situation where like starfish, you cut off a leg, well, it'll just continue to grow. It'll either grow a leg or just continue to move about its day and live accordingly. And, you cut off, you save some children. Well, they're just going to replace those children with more children. You're not really getting at the source versus the spider, you cut off the head, it's dead. And this is an assumption. I don't know this, but and maybe more of a question. These human traffickers at the large scale, like are they centralized? Is there one like head honcho that's like running the entire operation, or is it more decentralized where like there's just bits and pieces with no real leadership, and you cut one off and that doesn't really matter because it's a starfish and there's just more to go. Like what does that look like from an operational business standpoint within the human trafficking industry?
It's a great question, Stu. And honestly, it's one of the biggest misconceptions that we confront, in part because we watch movies and we see this in Hollywood, and we assume that trafficking is highly networked, that there's these large criminal organizations and enterprises that are driving trafficking across the planet. And it's not that that doesn't exist. It does exist. There are parts of the world where that happens. You see some of that in Eastern Europe. You see some of that. There's cartel-based models in Mexico. You see some of that in the illicit massage parlor industry coming out of China. So it's not that it doesn't exist, but that is not the dominant picture we should have in our head of a trafficker. Most trafficking is highly decentralized. It's smaller operators that aren't making game-changing money individually, but they're saying, like that brothel owner in India, well, I could pay an adult who's quote unquote voluntarily choosing to make money by engaging in commercial sex. I could pay that person to provide commercial sex, or I could basically buy this little girl and then not pay her at all and just force her, use force and threats and violence to coerce her into commercial sex. And at the end of the day, I'm just going to make more money doing that. Now, is that game changing money? No. But if the choice is, if take any business model you want, if I said, hey, I can magically transform your labor costs into profits, you're just going to make more money. So if the risk is effectively zero, even if those labor costs are very small, sure, there's a lot of people who will take that deal. Yeah, I'll take the deal. I'll turn my labor costs into profits if it just cost me a couple beatings, and no big deal. I'm happy to do that. And that's why when you see very little enforcement, the business of trafficking explodes wherever the laws are not enforced. It doesn't matter if there's laws in the books. The best predictor of is there a lot of trafficking in this location is look at enforcement. If enforcement is low, I guarantee you trafficking will be high. That is your best predictor. And so the good news about that is it's actually means that they're more deterrable because cost benefit crimes like trafficking are the easiest crimes to deter if you can elevate the costs so they outweigh the benefits. Well, if the benefits for each individual decentralized trafficker aren't that big, then even a modest increase in enforcement destroys the value of the business model. It just doesn't make sense anymore. If all of a sudden I realize, wait a second, now there's a specialized enforcement unit that could come in and seize all my profits, and now I lose all my money and my entire business and my family and my freedom and go to jail for the next 15 years. It's like, then it's not worth it. I'd rather pay a few extra shillings or dollars or rupees to quote unquote voluntary laborers than risk losing everything. And that's when you start to see these big drops in the prevalence of trafficking. So it's actually very good news that it's so highly decentralized. It's really not like the drug market where do have these larger cartels where the margins are so huge that you have these highly networked, organized criminal enterprises that are ready to openly take on law enforcement. They essentially are building paramilitary units to protect this high margin trade. And that is not what we see for the most part in the trafficking space. Even at the federal level, where we handle the most significant organized criminal cases, something like less than 1% of federal cases involve any kind of organized criminal enterprise. So that's part of the value of like actually gathering this data is you start to go, oh, Hollywood is telling a story that is not representative. That's not what most trafficking looks like. And the good news about that is even a modest increase in enforcement, we don't have to get all the traffickers to be successful. You just increase trafficking enforcement risk just a little bit, and it destroys the business model for most traffickers. And that's when you start to see these big drops in the prevalence of trafficking.
Yeah, it's interesting. And we saw. I'm blanking on the name of the movie that came out last year or the year before that was all focused on human trafficking, but that shows a picture of there being like one head honcho right in some location, and like that trail goes throughout different countries and even into the United States and into Mexico through the United States, and like it all leads to one source, right? This one big head honcho. And what I'm hearing you say is that's not the case. And so you can go and you know kill these smaller organizations in these countries and they understand, hey, this isn't even profitable, then that drastically reduces the amount of human trafficking going on in that location. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, that's right. It's not that it doesn't exist. It's just that it's the very, very small minority. That
Yeah.
organized criminal trafficking is not the dominant way we should picture trafficking because it's not representative, even here in
Yeah.
the US. And so, yeah, that is the good news about this is trafficking is a business and it operates like a business and it's very sensitive to cost and risk. And so if the benefits are very small, if your margins are small, then radically increasing your costs puts you out of business, right? Any business, if you had hey, I have a business, but it's very, very thin margins. And I said, well, what if I increase your cost 10x? You'd be like, that would put me out of business. There's no,
Yeah.
I would quit tomorrow and try to find something else. That's what's happening to traffickers. It's like, oh, I have these very thin margins. As long as the risk is zero, sure, I'll do it. I'll make a little more money. But if we can say, well, actually, your cost is about to go up 10x or 100x, then they start to go, wait a second, not worth it. I'm out. This doesn't make sense anymore. I'm out.
How do you battle kind of all the inside government, handling the table under the money and being a part of the team in these third world countries? Because again, this is assumptions because I'm not a part of it, but you hear all this going on, and like, how do you battle that?
So two things that were, I think, surprising to me as we started tackling that. One is you have some just incredible leaders who are genuinely committed just to doing the right thing in their country. You have these leaders. I've met these leaders who are just like, They really they don't know maybe how to deliver the kind of protection they would like to their people from trafficking, but they really care about it. And they just care about it for doing the right thing. They want to do the right thing for the right reason. The second is you do have corruption. And corruption, like trafficking, is a cost benefit crime. And it only exists where it's tolerated by senior officials. Now, in many developing countries, it is tolerated by senior officials. And here's how that kind of works. Here's how the incentives work. If I'm a senior official in a developing country and there's a bunch of police who are extracting petty corruption bribes, they're using their badge as a tool to extract bribes from low level people. The reality is, for the most part, it doesn't really, if I'm a high level bureaucrat, it doesn't really affect my life. So I don't really care if the police are extracting these petty corruption bribes. I'm not losing an election over it. It's not really, not really making a difference to me. But here's what's happened. In the year 2000, the US government passed a law that requires the State Department to assign a grade every year to every country in the world on how well they're combating trafficking. And if you get a failing grade, you're subject to economic sanctions from the US. What's one of the biggest factors in whether you get a failing grade? If there's corruption that you're doing nothing about. So now all of a sudden, if I'm that same senior bureaucrat, I'm going, whoa, whoa, whoa. At least when it comes to these trafficking enforcement teams, zero tolerance policy for corruption. If there is corruption, not only do you get fired, you get prosecuted and you go to jail because there's a lot more zeros at stake for me than there are for you. You pick up a few dollars in extra, petty corruption bribes, and I lose several $100 million in US funding. So that is one of the things that we've tried to do is to say, hey, it is amazing when you have leaders who want to do the right thing for the right reason. That's awesome. And we found more of those than I expected. And that's been a huge encouragement. And we didn't want a model that was required to depend on that. We wanted a model that could harness incentives and use incentives for governments to care about improving enforcement for totally self-interested reasons. So now you've got these senior officials who maybe didn't have a moral or spiritual epiphany about that value of that 12-year-old girl that's languishing in a brothel, but just in their own economic self-interest, they start shouting down the chain of command to police and prosecutors and judges. You guys got to get this fixed because this is now a problem for me. These traffickers are a roadblock standing between me and the economic objectives that I care about. The problem that we saw is that many of the people at the bottom of the chain, these police and prosecutors, are going, okay, we get it. We're incentivized, but we don't know how. This is actually pretty specialized, and none of us has ever we haven't done this before, so we don't know what to do. We get it. We're incentivized, but it was a little bit like saying, hey, here's some scrubs and a mask and a scalpel, and now you guys go do cataract surgery on this line of patients outside the door. I mean, if that literally happened to the three of us, I think we're probably there's a smart group right here. This is like
Yeah,
a
there's a lot of
That's
hurting.
great.
There's a
gifted
lot of
group.
hurting people in that line.
That's right. And if you really put yourself in that situation, I know it's a funny example, but if that really happened to you, if you literally were told, here's the scrubs, here's the mask, here's the scalpel, your family's livelihood really does depend on your ability to do cataract surgery on this line of patients outside the door. That's actually a pretty terrifying and a humiliating experience to be given this very high calling, but never equipped with the skills to do it. And we realize until you solve that problem, right? At that point, for us, it doesn't matter how incentivized we are, right? I can offer you $1 billion. I can threaten your family. You can't do cataract surgery. We don't know how to do it. And we realize until we solve that problem, we can pour trillions of dollars into anti-trafficking efforts and see no meaningful drop in prevalence. But if we do solve that problem, the laws are there, the incentives are there, and now we just need to take those parchment promises of law and equip police and prosecutors to make that a painful reality on the ground for traffickers that fundamentally collapses their business model. And that's what we're doing. That's what we're seeing. And we're seeing it's amazing to see. You have these police and prosecutors. I'll tell you just one story. We had a prosecutor in Uganda named Joseph. When I first met Joseph, not only had he never done a human trafficking case, he had never met anyone who had done a human trafficking case. We start working with him, and very quickly, he's a quick study. He becomes an incredibly high performer. And he becomes the lead prosecutor in a very powerful case involving a 10-year-old kid that ends up being trafficked by this headmaster who was exploiting 31 boys at his school We find out about this. We do a raid. We gather critical forensic evidence. We launch an investigation, expose that he's exploiting all these boys, and then we go to trial. And Isaac at the time was so tired of being abused by this guy that he ends up hiding in the school. He can't flee the campus. He ends up going and running the back of the school and hiding inside a pit latrine, which is literally like a hole in a shed that people use to go to the restroom. And he said, I'd rather hide in that hole and spend the night there than endure another night of this trauma. Next morning, clean lady shows up, finds this kid filthy and sobbing, cleans him up, gets enough of the story, sneaks him out at the back of the school to the police, who call us, and we launch this investigation. Joseph becomes the lead prosecutor in Isaac's case. And leading up to trial, he's working 60, 70-hour weeks to make sure that that trafficker never harms another kid again. And the judge in that case issues the first ever life sentence for a trafficker in Ugandan history. This becomes a seminal case. Joseph is, I have this amazing picture of Joseph that's one of my favorite pictures because you can just see him, the smile on his face. It's the exact opposite of that sense of humiliation. It's this sense of pride of like, hey, I had a high calling, and because I was equipped with the skills to do it, I stepped up and I delivered. And Isaac felt powerless to do anything about this 10-year-old boy. His parents felt powerless to do anything about it. But because I showed up, that guy now is spending the rest of his life in prison, and he will never harm another child again. And that's what we're doing. We're identifying the Josephs in the world, these guys who are so excelling in terms of leadership and performance and integrity that over time they can become the embedded mentors for their unit or for the next unit. And then over time, when those units can deliver high protection and replenish themselves with normal turnover, then Uganda is fully funding its own self sustaining units. So we get all the ongoing benefit of protection with no additional philanthropic cost. And about a year ago, we were very excited to see an internal memo where Joseph, who, like I said, when I met him, had never done a human trafficking case, goes from never having done a human trafficking case to becoming a very high performer to being named as the head over all human trafficking enforcement in Uganda. Now, when we showed up in Uganda, that was very small. Nobody was working trafficking cases. Today, there are over 1,500 Ugandan police and prosecutors funded by their own government working cases across the country. And they are delivering some of the highest performance on the planet in terms of enforcement. And Joseph is now the head of that unit. He is this tip of the spear driving this army that's bringing global freedom to an almost 50 million person country in a way that we've never seen before. And to me, that is sort of the incredible joy of what we get to do, to see guys like Joseph showing up, living into the professional joy of their calling, and then building out teams to do this effectively.
Dude, that is awesome. Not only what an amazing calling, what an amazing equipping force that you guys are, but you talk about impact and the level of impact, just such an interesting and absolutely just mind blowing. My brain is going crazy because of the not only the misperceptions that I had of how you get after the problem, because there's a lot of how do you prove a false negative, right? In meaning all the future traffickers that are dissuaded and are like, dude, I'm not playing this game. It's impossible to really, that person's not going to raise his hand and be like, hey, I was gonna do this and now I'm not because of what's happening. But just the fact that how much impact can be made. Hey, I know I could go for hours on this, but I do want to ask. I have had a question that I'm curious on. How is HTI funded? Like how do you guys keep going? How is it that you guys have the capacity to continue to do this?
Yeah, that was one of the big questions I had when I was sitting in my basement trying to figure out, hey, I just left the Justice Department. I think this is a really good idea. Who's going to fund it? Like, how is this actually going to? I've never raised money before. I don't know what to do here. And it's been just so humbling. I would say what I never expected, I'd say we are funded mostly by private individuals. So 90% of our funding comes from private individuals. About 10% of our funding comes from the US government or from institutional grants, but most of it comes from private individuals. And that ranges from soccer moms who are saying, "Hey, I'm going to do $25 a month to keep kids like Isaac out of that pit latrine and into freedom and prevent them from ever enduring that in the first place," to people who are giving 10 grand or 100 grand or $1 million. And I would say we've also had, to your point in your podcast, we've had a lot of guys in the business community, people who do asset management or private equity or venture capital, people who are used to thinking about the world in terms of return on investment. Those folks have felt like, hey, maybe it felt a little bit like I did. Like, oh man, I just feel like I'm backing away from the fire. Can we actually make a difference in this space? It feels really hopeless. Is there something really practical that we could do that could make a difference at scale? And for them, that's a model like, oh, we're harnessing incentives. We're not just relying on people to do the right thing for the right reason. We're harnessing incentives and we can actually drive down trafficking at scale. And for them, that's where it's like, okay, once I vetted this, we want to be really involved and we want to draw other people in. And that's a very small but very powerful group. And so that's part of my role is to sort of say, hey, if you're backing away from the fire like I was 25 years ago, you don't have to because the tangible hope exists. And let's not be in this horrific tragedy where we're backing away from the fire at the very moment where trafficking is ready to collapse at scale. And that's where we've seen people be incredibly generous and supporting the work. And I think it's been a joyful experience for the families too, because we have some families where you have multiple generations and you're like, yeah, how do I get, maybe we have different things that we're interested in. This is one of the only issues that we've come across that like doesn't matter what generation you are, doesn't matter what you're interested in. Everybody wants that 10-year-old kid out of that. They care about that. And that's been this kind of unifying giving experience for families where they felt like, hey, this is something we could be all proud of doing together. This is something that my teenage kid will be proud of about talking at lunch, like, hey, this is what we're doing as a family, where the grandparents and the parents, the grandparents can all feel like we are aligned, we're motivated. Feels joyful, like joyful giving, and it's something that we're excited to be a part of. So that's mostly where it comes from.
That's that's something that David and I are both passionate about is just using our businesses as a source, just to be better stewards, right? And give back to great causes like what you guys are doing. And so maybe this is a plug for that, for all of our listeners that have businesses, that have investments, that have capital they can use in a way to be donors, to be givers, to be better stewards of what's been provided to them. I say, look into that. We have a real close tie with an organization called National Christian Foundation. They create donor advised funds, and you can. There's some really cool ways strategically to place business dollars into that can be beneficial to you from an organization and standpoint too. So like look into that. Victor, what else? You had just with the short time left, you had mentioned before recording like how we as the individual can get more involved in something like what you're doing. Like, this is big, right? This is a like you look at this, you're like, oh man, like what can I do
Mm.
to be involved in something so big like what you're doing?
For me, one of the things that I realized is, trafficking is such a hidden crime that I could be listening to a podcast like this. Maybe I'm driving somewhere, I'm listening to a podcast and feel like, wow, maybe I feel like a different kind of hope that I've ever felt about trafficking for the first time. And with all the best intentions in the world, carpool and dinner and life can just swallow that up. And I could literally, with all the best intentions, not think about this again for the next year or two. And to me, as a Christian, for me, that's one of the reasons why I try to draw the scriptures before me every morning because I just need that reminder. I need some kind of habit that will form me to draw back to this thing that I know is important. And I think in this space, that's something I'd encourage. It's less about, yes, of course, it's wonderful we have people giving, large gifts, but I would encourage just as your own kind of formation, what would it look like to say, hey, I'm going to give, if it's $1 a month, like whatever the number, like just I'm going to go online and I'm going to just do that. And I'm going to use that as a kind of habit formation, as a kind of reminder that this hidden thing that's happening really is in the world and that I want to be part of stewarding whatever it is that I've been given in a way that really makes a practical difference for kids like Isaac. Like, what does it look like for me? And whatever that number is, I would encourage you just to do it, to do, I don't care what the number is, do it for you. Do it for you and your family. Build in a habit where at least every time you're looking at your bank statement every month, there's just this reminder of, hey, this is important. And this is a way that I can be a part of something historic that's changing the lives of kids like Isaac in the world. And that's what I want to be a part of. So I think that's just one encouragement that, when we have these things, that it's very easy for us to have incredible intentions and then not think about it again. And so just taking a very simple step, it could take literally 30 seconds where you say, I promise you, at the end of the year, you're going to look at whatever that number is, and I think you're going to feel very, very pleased. It's going to feel, it's going to be a source of joy, like the parable of the talents. What happens at the end of that when they take those talents and they don't bury them in the sand and just live in fear of losing them. But when they actually put those talents into the world and God multiplies them, there's this incredible sense of joy, right? What is the return? It's enter into the joy of your master. Well done, good and faithful servant. Enter into the joy of your master. And to me, there's no return. I don't care your 100x deal will never deliver the kind of joy that represents. And so to me, that's just an encouragement for you. It's of course it's great for us and it helps us do this work more effectively and expand this work out. But I think it's just a great, very simple, very easy discipline to take on to bring this before your mind to say, as a family, this is what we're doing together and we're making a difference. We're not just hearing the word, but we're doing something with it. And I think that's a great opportunity to be a part of that.
Amazing, man. Well said. How do we get more people to connect with you, and what do we put in the show notes where they can find out more information about HTI?
Yeah, so our website is traffickinginstitute.org. We'll put that in the show notes if that's okay.
Yep.
And we have justice partners that just participate at a monthly level at a bunch of different at a bunch of different levels, and it's a great way to kind of build in that discipline. It's something where if you whatever your number is, it's a way to just get you engaged and get you plugged in a way that I think is uncommon in this space. A lot of times, I think I hear lots of stories that really are so paralyzing. We sort of say, oh, look at this massive problem. It's so huge. And then it's just crushing and it's paralyzing. And you feel like, well, I don't want to hear about this thing that I'm powerless to do anything about. I think this is the opposite. This is kind of going to give you an experience of very tangible hope that will feel really good to you and your family. And so that would be my encouragement. That's just sort of an easy way to jump in, and then you'll get kind of some updates. You'll learn what's going on, and I think it can be a source of encouragement to those of us who have felt like pulling away, backing away from the fire, and feel like now, hey, we can engage, and we want to be a part of what's happening in the world to see trafficking fall at scale.
It's so good. So good. And when you talk about the talents, I just praise God that you decided to take your talents, your skill set, the things that you are passionate about and the ways that you've been blessed and to use that for something different. Obviously doing great work with the in the government, but man, there's gonna be I firmly believe there's gonna be a line of people in heaven and you're gonna be completely humbled by the fact of how many lives that you've touched and changed just by being willing to take your talents and deploy them in a way that is just completely honoring to God and His children. And dude, it's what an awesome episode, what an awesome conversation. Super super grateful for you, Victor, and also look forward to getting to know you better and plugging deeper into just the mission that you guys are putting forth. So awesome stuff, dude. Keep it up.
Thanks, David. It's just to me, just the last thing I'll say is that is such a beautiful picture of the body of Christ. Because yes, it's some people say that, and I feel like, well, what a joy that I get to just wake up every day and get to do this work. But the reality is, I couldn't do this work without some very generous people saying, hey, we feel powerless in this space. We can't go spend the next 20 years building specialized human trafficking enforcement skills, but we are really good at building a business and creating value. And we have more resources than maybe we need. And without those resources, me and more importantly, this incredible team that we've built that are leaving their jobs and moving overseas to do this work, they couldn't do it without that. It's like that's the body of Christ, different parts with different functions that are collectively working together as a unit to drive kingdom impact. And that's the fun thing is to say, hey, what would it look like one day to actually get to meet all these families, all these children who may never know our name, they may never hear about HTI. They may never know your name. They may never know the names of the listeners who become justice partners. But because of our faithfulness, because we were willing to offer up our loaves and fish, they got to experience a level of freedom that maybe spared them from ever enduring this trauma in the first place. And that would be such a deep joy to be a part of together.
So cool, man.
It's good. It's
Guys and
good.
gals, reach out to Victor, Human Trafficking Institute. Put the link in the show notes. Victor, this has been amazing. Thank you.
Thank you guys.
See ya.
See you.